On December 29th of last year, a shooter walked into the West Freeway Church of Christ, opened fire, and killed 2 of their members. The head of security then returned fire and in less than 6 seconds ended the situation. Could this happen at your congregation? Are you prepared for such an event as this? Tonight, we're going to talk about guns in the church building. We're going to have as our guest Kevin Sutton, an experienced police officer, and Matt Vega, a lawyer, to discuss church security and the legal ramifications. We hope you'll join us tonight for GBN Live.
Live from the Gospel Broadcasting Network, located just outside of Memphis, Tennessee. Be a part of today's episode by calling in or interacting with us through Facebook. Now from Olive Branch, Mississippi, it's GBN Live.
Hello and welcome again to GBN Live. I'm Mike Hickson. So glad that you're with us tonight on Thursday evening. We appreciate so much the opportunity to come into your home and talk about biblical principles. Tonight, we're going to be discussing a very important subject, guns in church buildings. And we have with us tonight Kevin Sutton and Matt Vega. And guys, glad to have you.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
We are so glad to be together. I guess by way of introduction tonight, I think about the change in landscape across our country. And this is not the America that I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Things have changed so dramatically. And there was a time when it seemed as if, as a matter of fact, when I think about my youth, we never locked doors. We didn't worry about violence, gun violence, et cetera. We certainly didn't think about the potential of violence in a church building, et cetera, a house of worship. But that's different today. And so maybe by way of introduction, and I know that you guys are looking at it in some ways from the same vantage point, but in other ways a little bit different. You have a legal background, and of course you have a law enforcement background. But talk, if you would, about the change of landscape in this country and maybe how that's been contributory to where we are today.
Well, I think you've made a good observation that probably we have never been a more private society than we are today in terms of the facilities and what's open to the public and what has armed security cameras and armed security guards and all kinds of fencing. If you think about almost any place you enter now is more closed off than it was 50 years ago, and less accessible and more heavily monitored and watched. The only exception to that are the churches. They are still, for the most part, very open, and intentionally so. We want to provide an open invitation to the community, and that becomes the Achilles heel. That becomes the vulnerability.
Yeah, you know, to your point, this past week I was at the Med, which is a incredible hospital here in Memphis area. Matter of fact, they probably have the top-rated trauma unit in West Tennessee. And as I entered the complex, they had installed in just the entryway, really reminding me of airport security. You've got to go through and get checked whether or not you're carrying a weapon or anything that might potentially harm someone. And I thought about, just a sign of the times. And so it is a different world.
You know, something Matt said made me think of this. Speaking about the Lord's church, I have found, and based on observation, we basically got three, we talk about church security, I'm finding 3 types. You've got congregation 1 who doesn't talk about church security. They have no plans. They really don't even know who, if anyone, maybe brother so-and-so carries, and most of the time. And then you've got congregation number 2 who they pretty much know who carries, but they still haven't, they're not well organized, they haven't done any type of training at all. And then you got congregation 3 who has took the steps. They've talked with their insurance company. They've got someone local from their community, from their sheriff's office or police department, who's got some expertise, some years of experience on what they can do and what they shouldn't do based upon their state law, because every state's different, and every, what you can do in Georgia may not be necessarily what you can do in Alabama or the state of Mississippi. The concealed carry is different. So they really need to, those elders or those men's, men's group, they need to find out and go from 1 to 2, and I have found that's where most everybody's at.
Yeah, the Christian Security Network recently reported a statistic online, and what they indicate is they found about 75% of churches have no security plan.
75%?
75%.
Right. And
Wow.
I'm finding that's, I'm very thankful that a lot of congregations of the Lord's people are stepping up. They're heading in the right direction, but I'm finding, and even among brethren, they're 1 and 2. They're not 3. And leaderships need to change that and stop being such a soft target.
Sure. Let me ask this question, and then I want to go back to maybe the 75% that you mentioned a moment ago. But you talked just a moment ago about the fact that in many congregations we are not protected by and large. And on the one hand, we do want to be open and inviting, and we want people to come in, and yet at the same time, you have to be careful in this day and time. So where's the balance, I guess, in all of that?
Well, it can be tough. A lot of this is common sense to some folks, and maybe it's not common sense to others. But if you have a stranger that comes in among you, how's he dressed? Overcoat with a backpack,
And a wig. Like white settlement.
Congregations can tag a couple of their armed team members to sit close to that guy without saying anything to anybody. I mean, that's just one option.
Let me ask you this question, and this has come up, as a matter of fact, this has come up where I attend. One of the guys that has taken the lead at our congregation with regard to security is in law enforcement. He is an agent with the FBI. And he's talked about if someone comes in wearing clothing that immediately draws attention, that, as you said a moment ago, someone needs to be on him. We talk about profiling. And I know that there are legalities and whatnot, but at the same time, we do have to exercise caution. Mm-hmm. And, it's better to be safe than to be sorry.
Well, I think there's a difference between, and maybe Matt can chime in on this, but there's a difference between law enforcement profiling and just a private citizen paying special attention to someone. And
that is, for constitutional purposes, there is a different standard. But my perspective is there's a number of things that you can do across the board with everyone without, singling out anyone. And many of those things are just good evangelism techniques. If you think about the warmest, most welcoming congregation you've ever been in, what was that experience like? Did you get to come in there, no one speak to you, sit on the back row by yourself, and no one approaches you? No. The most inviting congregations are ones that identify their visitors, get information about their visitors, offer to give them a rainbow sticker on their lapel so that everybody can identify them as a visitor, has a member of the congregation actually sit with them in the congregation. It's not because they're singling them out because they're worried about them, it's because they want to get to know them better. The scriptures talk about greeting one another with a holy kiss. If we were to get back to a practice of just warmly greeting someone, when you close that gap, that distance, to extend the hand of fellowship and shake their hand, maybe take their arm, you're going to coincidentally get to know them better and be able to assess whether there's any risk. And again, the purpose should not be to determine whether they're carrying a gun or they pose a danger. The purpose should just be to be in a warm and inviting congregation, and you'll get the ancillary benefit.
Yes, yes.
at the same time, if you've got a suspicious cell in your body, you can size that up. I mean, I'm guilty of that, and I make no apologies for it. But I do, as one of the elders of the church there, I do want to meet our visitors, and I greet them and shaking their hand and friend, where are you from?
Yeah.
You know, and you do that, but at the same time you're warm, as Matt's saying, and you welcome them. And if you know, it's very difficult to get to a point to say, okay, we need to take this a little bit further.
Sure.
Could a congregation, could one of the men or a couple of men ask the guy to step to the foyer? It may get to that. I mean, if enough red flags goes off, what if he's intoxicated? And I know this may get into one of our other questions in a little while. What if he gets unruly? Those are good questions, and that's where some training comes in, because sometimes brethren just don't know what they, you know, when do I cross the line? Should I cross the line? Those are good questions. That's where training comes in, and based on your, again, state law and every congregation. You know, I visualize where I'm from. We think about where you guys think about where you're from. You take a large congregation in a large city, they're different from us. It may not be, and I've heard members of the church say this before, oh, it's not unusual for us to have a couple of strange faces every Lord's Day.
We have lots of visitors every week.
Yeah.
Many visitors,
Right.
Lots of new faces. Let me ask this. You mentioned the 70% with regard to lack of protection, so to speak. 75%. So we talk about those steps, 1, 2, 3. Let's just assume that, as you said a moment ago, you got 75% of the people not protected. So if you were going into a congregation and they have absolutely no protection, where would you begin, and what steps would you encourage them to take to protect themselves?
Well, I would, every state's different. You have to abide, obviously, by your state law. You need to get someone, if your eldership, you wouldn't believe over the past many weeks, I get a call from Preacher A from Arkansas, Preacher B from Alabama, and so many of the leaders they really don't know what to do. They're overwhelmed. They're just overwhelmed, but they don't know whether should we do this, should we not do this? If we do this, this. If we don't, this. I would suggest those elders, those in charge, to meet someone from their community, someone that's in the know, someone that has had training in this area, and talk with them about it. The ground is not going to open up and swallow them if they have a conversation about church security. And it's so many times I've seen congregations develop a team, and without exception, especially their older members, who some of those church leaders, I've even heard them say this before, oh, we don't want to scare them by having armed members here. They've said that. And without exceptions, those congregations that I've seen go from 1, 2 to 3 to where they should be, those older members would come up and say, thank you so much for doing this. This should have been done 2 or 3 years ago. Sure. So they're finding out, oftentimes it's the reverse of what they thought.
It starts by assessing the risks, and every congregation is going to have different vulnerabilities. One congregation may have 1 exit. Another congregation have 7 or 8. One may have just the sanctuary and classrooms right off the foyer, and others may have separate buildings. And so someone with some expertise would work with a committee of individuals from that congregation to determine the different threats. Then you develop a security plan and develop close ties with local law enforcement to review that security plan. And then part of that security plan would include equipping a security team. Sure. But then the big question is whether or not whether you're going to have a security team. I think that's appropriate, and you really ought to have a security team of 2 or 3 people for the average church. And for every 100 members more you have than the average, I'd add another person or 2 to the security team. So the hardest question for me that I think churches face is not whether to determine their risks and to come up with some plans, or even whether to have a security team and have appropriate electronic surveillance and that kind of thing. The hardest question is whether to arm them, and then what to do with the members who may be licensed to conceal carry. That's the tricky one.
You know, we have a security team, and they are all armed. We have retired policemen. We have active police, and so we have, you know, we've been blessed in that respect. But one of the things, the recent occurrence that happened in Texas, because it was inside the auditorium in the assembly area, that heightened alert on our part, and so you know, then it carried the conversation in. Okay, now we need to be proactive inside the assembly, not just in the hallways, not just by way of the doors, entrance, exits, etc.
Absolutely, and I wanted to say this earlier, but you know, the United States no doubt has the greatest military that's ever been. Police officers have never been as trained as they are now. I'm not saying perfect, I'm just saying more trained. Military people die. Police officers die often. As well as they're trained, we have casualties. A congregation cannot be completely bulletproof. If our military and the police can't,
That's right.
neither can congregations. But that does not mean that they cannot develop a team based upon in lines with their state law, get someone locally that's done this before, that can document this, document the training, what was covered, put that in print, communicate with your insurance company, as I did for the church in Adairsville. Actually spoke with their attorney on the phone from Illinois, a real nice lady, and she said, well, I suggest this, 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 and this. And I said, yes, ma'am. And I said, that's what we're already doing. I said, and we actually purchased some additional coverage. So we satisfied what they wanted and what they liked, and they was very pleased. Now, I've heard of it, some insurance companies canceling. I don't know who does and who does not, but ours was very, she was very positive about the things that we had implemented in Adairsville, Georgia. And I suggested a couple of things that she hadn't even thought of, and she said, oh, that's even better.
That's good.
So there's things you can do.
Sure. One of the questions that's come in tonight via Facebook, how many members should be carrying? And I know that's a subjective question because, you know, not every place is the same. But I think back to what you guys said, you should have armed people protecting your premises. Is that correct?
Yes. No question about it. You know, when we was, as you started off the show, Mike, back in our days, we never thought about it. Well, this is no longer our days. This is a new day. And doesn't mean we need to be paranoid. Doesn't mean that we need to, you know, pat everybody down that comes in the back of the building. But, you know, I think it was the Lord that said, we got to be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We have to be smart.
That's right.
And we can do that without being offensive. But as far as the number goes, you know, what's the magic number? We have a dozen at Adairsville. And the most that we'll ever have right now in the congregation on a special day or something, you know, how folks do on special days, we'll bump 150. But there's about a dozen of us that's gone through our training and who is armed.
I want to go back to your comment about whether or not we should have armed security or armed members. And I do think that you definitely need a security team. Whether or not you arm them is dependent on their availability for training and their ability to properly handle a gun. It's not just the foreseeability of an active shooter that you need to worry about from a legal liability standpoint. It's also the foreseeability of an accidental shooting. And so every state has a different approach to concealed carry. But the first distinction I would make is between security teams and armed security teams. The second distinction is between armed security teams and armed members. And I believe if you're blessed with qualified security people that are, for example, post-certified active law enforcement officers who are members of your church, it would be a blessing to have them armed as security, as part of your security team.
Sure.
For example. Then to the second question of whether you arm them or whether the members are armed, that depends on your state. Now, he's from Georgia, and in Georgia and about 6 other states plus DC, the law requires you to actively, affirmatively give permission to members or to anyone licensed to carry in the building. That creates a little higher risk for the congregation's leaders, because you're actually not deputizing them, but you are affirmatively authorizing them to be carrying the gun in the building. In Tennessee and most of the states, 40 some odd states, the law is the opposite. And that is, they have the right to carry unless you specifically prohibit them from carrying. And therefore, you don't have to take an affirmative step as a leader to say, I hereby deputize or authorize you to have a gun in this assembly. You're just not posting a sign banning those guns. And it's a little lower legal risk. But again, I'm not suggesting that legal risk is the only consideration, because the risk exists if you don't have anybody armed as well as if you arm them. I'm just saying that foreseeability of risk is something you have to look at both ways.
Gotcha. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back, and a lot more questions I know will emerge in our study, but a lot of thought-provoking things that have been said thus far. Thank you, guys. We'll be back in just a moment.
So how do you know whether your Bible has been corrupted? You know, the youngest part of the Bible is about 2,000 years old. It's an old book. And it came from Greek, went into Latin, and then to English. So it's kind of like the game telephone, right? So how many of you know why we can actually trust the Bible? Anybody think it's been corrupted? Anybody want to maybe try to explain this one to us?
You can watch the latest episodes of GBN Live on YouTube after tonight's show. You can search for Gospel Broadcasting Network or simply go to youtube.com/GBN TV. Press the red subscribe button at the top right of the page and you will be notified when new content is available. Stay tuned after the show for some more excellent gospel content.
Fills my heart with joy and love.
Thank you for staying with us. We are back from break. We are talking tonight about guns in church buildings and obviously the changes that have taken place across the landscape of America. It used to be that you didn't have to worry about some of the things that we're discussing tonight, but it is a different time, different age. Another question's come in tonight. When the first century church faced security threats, how did they handle it? Did they have security in place? Interesting question.
You know, I would go all the way back to the Old Testament and to the rebuilding of the wall in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 4, there's this great verse about how they're worried about external threats. And their plan They came up with a plan, a security plan, and the plan was very simple. They prayed to God, and then each man was armed and set as guard to as a protection against the outside threat. And I think that's that wise as serpent approach.
Was that Nehemiah 4?
Nehemiah chapter 4.
That's good stuff.
Verse 9.
Good stuff.
He stood and watched, or they stood and watched.
In our discussion tonight, we've talked about training those who are part of the security team. What about, let's go inside the assembly, and let's think about an assembly is in the act of worshiping God, and a scene unfolds, and you've got an active shooter. What about training the members to respond quickly under fire, so to speak?
In my opinion, the congregation has one job to do, and it consists of a couple of added things to it, but really it's just overall it's one job. They're to get down. Now that doesn't mean
In the floor.
In the floor. That doesn't mean leaning over. That doesn't mean I'm going to peep. That means, and again, this goes back to what I said, earlier, none of us, we can't completely bulletproof ourselves.
Sure.
But in my opinion, get down on the floor, bad knees and arthritis and all. You lay down, get down, grab the nearest person next to you on the way down. You get down, you stay down, and you be quiet. There's no leaning over, there's no screaming and hollering if you can.
I was going to say, sometimes when things happen like that, pandemonium breaks out, and people just go, they lose, they lose control. They really do.
Understandable.
And I understand that, but at the same time, what you said, you have to have a plan in place. You have to be proactive.
Yeah, the federal government has, after these shootings were occurring in schools a number of years ago, the federal government did a lot of effort to bring education to the teachers and to the students and to parents. And I think all of that material is easily available online, and churches ought to be taking advantage of it. And the three mantras that they advocated were to run, hide, or fight. Run, hide, or fight. And depending on your situation, you may be able to run away. But if you can't, then you get down under the pews and you hide. And if you're in a classroom, you barricade the door. But ultimately, you may have to fight and go after that gun, because the studies from the FBI, they haven't developed the perfect profile yet for who would engage in this kind of active shooter behavior. But the one thing they agree on wholeheartedly is that they're not going to stop until they're stopped.
That's right.
So you may have to fight.
You triggered a thought in my mind, Matt. I was thinking about when I was in elementary school. We used to have regular fire drills, and we had a plan of action, and every class was to follow that plan of action. We were to orderly get out of the building. And I think by the same token, that's what you're talking about here. Have a plan in place, be preemptive.
Well, if you have, and again, we're speaking in general here. Every situation is different, but most of the congregation is not going to be near the shooter. They need something to separate them between, and if it is running, then that. But those, a lot of our pews are pretty solid. They'll take a couple of, there's some separation between you and the bad guy. And if your team does what they're supposed to do and what they've been trained to do, if they've had some training, maybe they can do what they've been trained to do. But if the congregation gets in the way, if they're up and running and screaming, everything can just
unravel.
And now it's really chaotic. It's really chaotic. I would not second guess anyone if they was on the back row. If they could slip out, then their life is saved. But I'm speaking in general terms here.
What do you do in a situation where, let's say that you've got somebody who comes into the assembly, and no red flags have been raised, and they stand up and they pull a gun? Do you negotiate? Do you talk to what course of action should be taken?
Well, not knowing every state law, I can only speak for Georgia. Georgia law, and it's probably written in every code section, maybe in every other state, but it's what's reasonable. The word reasonable comes up. If it's reasonable to suspect that this fella, man or woman, is fixing to take the life of another, then you can defend yourself. They can defend themselves. Now, if the guy's got the drop on you, negotiation may be in order. Maybe there's only 2 guys that's armed, that's been trained, and one of them, he was out sick today and there's only 1 guy there. It's hard to answer those type questions,
Yeah, the person, that hypothetical didn't tell me who that person was,
right,
and whether they were armed, and whether they were close enough to actually, knock the gun away. But
right,
there is a legal right to use lethal force if you have a reasonable apprehension of lethal force being used against you. But that you may not be armed, so that's not an option.
Yeah,
right.
Okay,
yeah.
And if you're close enough, your best option might be to fight, to actually try to take that gun away.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're, an older woman, not armed, not physically able, obviously she's going to take one of the other 2 options.
Yeah. Let me ask this from a legal perspective. Do you know of any places that shootings have occurred, and let's say the perpetrator has been killed? Do you know of any type of lawsuits that have come forth as a result of that?
Well, I don't know about churches specifically, but law enforcement officers are routinely prosecuted by the perpetrator who was injured in subduing them, sure, and so, or in a shooting even, and so you can just assume there is always a risk of some kind of legal action being taken against all sides.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we haven't talked about tonight, and Mike, you may be going to ask this question in just a little while, but I wanted to throw this in while I had it on my mind. We are more apt to lose a member of our congregations many, many times over due to heart attack, stroke, choking. I can remember in my lifetime, we've had 2 members at our congregation got broken bones. One of them was my mother. Fell, broke her arm. Having people in place for that. I mean, oftentimes we concentrate on shootings, and rightfully so, but do we have these other people in place? My wife, Teresa, she's diabetic. Do you have orange juice in the refrigerator?
Yeah.
Do you have I'm drawing a blank right now, the defibrillators. Do you have those? About $1,000, $1,200, I understand, and you're in business.
They'll save lives.
They'll save lives.
We have one in our foyer.
Mm-hmm. And you have training so that there's several people that can use it.
Yeah, well, and we are fortunate in that we have some medical personnel mm-hmm. who are members of the congregation. And, just thinking back over the years of preaching and teaching, I know that one occasion years ago, a gentleman had a stroke. I was preaching, had a stroke. I remember another occasion, a man, I think his heart stopped, mm-hmm. and had a nurse or had a lady behind him, put him on the floor quickly, and she said, "We got to get medical help now." Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's unnerving to a congregation, mm-hmm. but those things do happen.
We, our youngest son, Tate preaches for the Cleveland Church of Christ in Bankston, Alabama. But when he was just a small fella, someone ran in. I was teaching my high schoolers, and someone ran in and said, "Kevin, Tate's choking." Well, I sprinted across I was a lot slimmer then. I sprinted across the auditorium, but my wife had already got there, and she did the Heimlich. It was a piece of candy. He was choking, and of course he was crying when I got there. Of course that was I loved to hear that cry.
Absolutely.
Because he was breathing, and so things like that are so much more. Just having someone in the, there's a lot of folks in the medical business nowadays, and our congregations are filled with these people, nurses, that's got that training. Let them take care of stuff like that. Let them make sure that all of that's in place, and you give them a job. It's funny when church leaders give folks a job. A lot of times they do their jobs.
I tend to think a lot of people are looking for something to do,
Yeah.
and they relish that opportunity to use their expertise.
Well, they all have different skills and abilities, and those can help equip the saints.
That's right. That's right. Other questions come in. What does the Bible say about self-defense?
I find this interesting, and I wrote this down. What is found in Luke 22. I anticipated this question. I find this really. We know our Lord taught the greatest teacher. Jesus taught with parables. He taught in a various number of ways, and he would give an illustration. But in Luke 22. Let's go down to verse about 36. Yeah. Well, I have said the wrong one. Which verse am I thinking about?
Luke 22:36.
22:36.
22:36.
Yeah. If you don't have a sword,
No. That is a good one. Let's talk about that one for a minute. Here is Jesus saying, this weapon of death, this weapon that can be a weapon of defense. Jesus said, "Get you." They said, "Well, Lord, we got two." Well, that's enough. And of course that's where I wound up going to. But where's the verse? Help me out here. Where Jesus gave the illustration when he said, and he was talking about his return, and he mentioned that if a man knew when his house was going to be broken into.
Oh, in Matthew 26.
Matthew
24. I mean.
Yeah, I was not real close.
Matthew 24, verse 42, beginning.
I want you to think about this. But know this, the Lord said, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he'd have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Really, Jesus? And of course, I think the context there is about his return, but he wouldn't give a sinful illustration. Those people understood that then, and we understand that now. Well, you'd be at the house. Defense, self-defense, and we could talk for another hour about the number of scriptures that's found, as we talked about in Luke 22. The Lord said, sell some of that and get you a sword. They was going in some dangerous places, kind of the hood of their day, and the Lord knew that, and they said, "Well, Lord, we got a couple." We got two. Well, that's good.
And obviously you don't want to escalate things if you don't have to.
Sure.
But the basic principle is that you have the right to exercise your rights to defend yours, your family, your property. And I think property rights and protecting your family are both legitimate biblical principles. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully you can use the legal means, you exercise your legal rights like Paul did in Acts 16.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if necessary, I think you
there's certain rights that we enjoy as citizens in this country, and we can avail ourselves of those rights just as Paul did as a Roman citizen.
And I do think there's an important distinction between our individual duties and our group duties when we become responsible for a group. You can, as an individual, you turn the other cheek, and you can have an ethic that is self-sacrificing. But as the leader of a group, it's incumbent on you to fulfill your duty and your responsibilities as the leader of that group to protect that flock, if you will. That's part of the reason why I think elders are identified in Scripture as shepherds.
Yeah. Well, in Romans 13, Paul talks about the civil government, the fact that they exist to protect us from evildoers. And
And so they have the right to do things that we as individuals don't. The military or a police officer, they have not only the right but the duty to do more than individuals do.
And often, I've not heard this verse used. We was talking about the military. We was talking about the laws of the land, Romans 13. I've not heard this verse used but a time or two. But I'd like to bring attention to Acts 25, verse 11. And this is a good verse for showing that capital punishment is authorized as well, I believe. In verse 11 it says, if I am an offender or have committed anything, listen, deserving of death. Wait a minute, Paul, an apostle, inspired, you mean there can be things and were things deserving of death? I think that's a pretty good argument, and we're going off here, capital punishment. Sure. But he goes on to say, I do not object to dying if I'm guilty of this. But
no, that's a great verse.
I think it is because Paul there is you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, because I think that if you take that option off the table, if you say as a Christian I can never take another human life, then what you've done is you have put a cap on the value of human life. Sure. And if you recognize the value of human life, then you have to allow for some punishment to rise to the level of capital punishment, because sometimes that's what's deserved.
That's right. And Paul talks about bearing the sword in vain. Mm-hmm. And if capital punishment is not enforced, then that's exactly what he's talking about. And so, without laws and boundaries, we have anarchy. And it may be the case that in our country, our judicial system, and I mean, this is a whole other subject, but, maybe we have been so lax in some areas that
it is a different subject, but it isn't. All we're talking about is the same principle in a different sphere. That there is the government sphere, and they keep society in order by wielding the sword. But in the sphere of your home, sometimes you have to defend the home using the same
Good
tools.
Point. Great point.
Well, there is a world of difference, and this is where people that I've met and talked with, they think the lines blur. Listen, vengeance is mine, God said. That is not self-defense. There is a vast difference between the two. We could go to Exodus, chapter 22, that talks about, God laying down the law and says if a man's found breaking in and his blood is shed, and there shall be no guilt for his blood shed. What is that, Exodus 22, 13?
Don't you think the Lord, what the Lord prohibited was taking matters into our own hands and retaliating, personally retaliating?
Well, the verse goes on to say, but if the sun is risen on him, in other words, if he's escaped and it's a few hours later, you don't track him down, and that's vengeance. But if he's caught in the act, and that's where I believe that the Jews got themselves in trouble. They took the judicial. We could look at this verse. We could talk about, and maybe we'll have time about turning the other cheek. Matthew 5:39. That's all about and saturated in vengeance. And
the implication was that when they tracked him down, they were going to take fatal response, a lethal response. And once the lethal threat has passed, it's no longer equitable for you to still use a lethal response.
Yeah, and the Jews would they took the judicial rule, what the courts, and Jesus didn't have a problem with the magistrates, they were called. They took that to the street. That would be vengeance, not self-defense. Yeah. And they're totally
big difference.
They're different.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Hope you'll stay with us for our final portion of this program.
We will be taking videos that we have found that teach religious error, and we're going to examine them in the light of the Bible.
Are you willing to test what you've been taught against the Bible to see if it's actually truth?
It's right here where Jesus came to be with his friends, to teach lessons about life.
I decided to do something for
the first time, to look for myself and see if the things I'd always believed were in there.
Hello and welcome again to GBN Live. Always great to be with you.
It was then that I carried you, and that touches our hearts to know that God is there to sustain us.
And says, who is Jesus? What would you do? We can know God's Word, we can understand it if we would just simply study.
Hope and trust that you have your Bible, and I invite you now to open it with me so that we might study the Word of God together.
The Gospel Broadcasting Network is proud to bring you GBN Live. To have your questions answered on the program, please call us at 888-805-3390. That's 888-805-3390. Please try to keep your questions relevant to tonight's topic. If you have a different topic that you would like to have discussed on GBN Live, please email your request to gbnlive@gbntv.org, and we will do our best to accommodate your request.
Thank you for staying with us. We are in the final stages of our program. We appreciate so much you being with us tonight. We want to get back to one of our questions that I think needs to be looked at maybe more in depth. What other types of emergencies should a congregation be prepared for?
You know, we're focused right now on the possibility of an active shooter. And it's not that that's out of the possibility. We have to deal with that. Approximately 4% of shootings in the United States are taking place in houses of worship, according to the Department of Homeland Security. But that said, we mentioned earlier that there are other risks that we need to be prepared for, like someone having a diabetic seizure or a heart attack. But from a legal perspective, one of the top 5 legal risks, the number 1 or number 2 risk is the vulnerable children and something happening to them, either sexual abuse, which is a risk that you need to prepare for, or some kind of accident occurring on the premises liability. And I think that what a church needs to do is not only have a security team and a security plan, but even a more broad plan, which we generally refer to as a safe church policy, that says, here are all the possible risks of things that could happen to the most vulnerable among us, the elderly, the children, and then making preparations to mitigate those risks best they can.
Good stuff, good stuff. One of the things that we did want to address, one of the questions we had to do with securing our entrances and exits. I know that some congregations leave their doors open throughout the entirety of their meeting times. I remember this going back quite some time ago, but I came out the side of our auditorium, our assembly area, and someone had turned the light out in the hallway, and our fellowship hall is behind our assembly area. So when I came out of the side entrance, I'm in the dark, and a man comes out of nowhere from the fellowship hall and said, "Hey, I need some gas." Well, my first question was, where did he come in? How long had he been in the back? And I thought, you know, what if this guy had a gun? And I walk out the side. I mean, there just so many things came through my mind. So, what about securing our doors?
I can tell you what we do, and I'm a fan of this at our place. And every building's different. And as you said, Mike, some congregations may have 5 or 6, but we have 3 places at our building that we can come in and go out. But 2 of those, and we're well within our fire codes, and they're solid doors. When they shut, they're locked. Now you can go out by push the bar and you walk right out.
You can't come back in.
But you cannot come back unless you got a key. And someone with evil on their mind, they're not going to have a key. But we have one access, and we have in our newsletter each week. It says who has announcements, just like everybody else. It's the song leader for your duty. We have one of our armed team members. They do the for your duty, and it's one way. And I'm a fan. One way in, and one way out. And as we dismiss, he's the first one that goes out. That's part of his job that we've asked them to do, and scan the parking lot and look for evil. Sure. But yes, one way in, one way out is great. And some of the places that's asked me to come and like do a building survey and tell us what you think about this, cameras and this entrance and all. Listen, some of the places, their back doors, and many of our buildings are old. We all understand that, but some of their back doors and side doors, the average 5th grade girl
could get in.
Could get into, and I say this as kind as I know how, but listen, the church is a saving institution. It is not a savings institution, and I think sometimes that church, the elders of congregations, and I understand the autonomy, okay? But turn loose some of that money and get you some good doors. Home Depot, Lowe's, sell some good ones. And hire somebody that knows what they're doing. Just because Brother Jim 40 years ago knew how to build birdhouses, okay, and he was pretty good at it, sometimes we'll get those guys to take out the old door jambs and the old doors. Don't we do that in the church? Don't do that. Get you a contractor, somebody that knows how to take that thing out properly, put that thing in there, and it would take 2 men with sledgehammers to come in. Well, you can be there and taking appropriate action, you know, and checking out this. They're not coming in if you do it properly. We need to spend a little money on some of this sometimes. And glass is that's not always a real nice thing either. I seen something recently at the Lafayette Church of Christ over in Lafayette, Georgia. They got some glass doors around front, but I seen pictures of what they've put. These nice, you can call them bars, but they don't look like bars. They're very attractive, and so even if someone did break the glass, they still can't get in. And I think, my understanding, they purchased those at Home Depot. Okay. But they're installed professionally. Looks very nice. A lot of things you can do like that.
Sure. I think that's, as far as doors, there are a number of exits in many churches for a reason. Mm-hmm. And so many churches won't lock those or make them inaccessible until after services have begun. But they still would install cameras, still have security patrolling, and so that's sort of a more balanced way to approach it. But it's impossible to completely eliminate the risks as long as it's an open to the public kind of building.
You used the word balance, and I think about, there are two extremes: overreacting, underreacting. So how do we strike a balance in everything we're talking about tonight?
Well, you used the word reasonable earlier. That's the legal standard. Foreseeability. How foreseeable is it that an active shooter could be a risk at your congregation? It's not enough to know that they are out there, but there are a lot of red flags that if there is some domestic disputes, if there was some kind of violent situation in the parking lot, if there was a shooting down the street, then you have a higher risk and you need to take more aggressive steps.
A couple other questions very quickly. Someone asked, give your thoughts if someone comes in with a knife. What should be done to stop that individual?
Well, as we said earlier, if a life is about to be, and I'm giving you just a general definition here, if it's reasonable to suspect that a life is fixing to be taken, then you can defend with lethal or deadly force. You can do that. Now, I will caution, and let me change this just a little bit, just to lay down this principle. If you're let's just say you're in the church building by yourself. You're the preacher, and you're up there at the podium and you're practicing and you just happen to be armed that day, and you're practicing your sermon. A guy comes in the back building and he's 70 feet from you and he's got a ball bat. That's not reasonable. The threat is not present.
To take a shot.
That's right. The preacher has the opportunity to leave. He's got some options. It's not up close and personal. Now, if the situation is someone with a knife, it's just like with police officers. If our lives can be taken, then we can take deadly force action. But it has to be reasonable, and it's very hard to say what that foot line is. It's 15 feet. Well, now it's 9.5 feet. And again, as we've said, what's reasonable. So I hope that brings out.
I think that helps.
Because none of us have a crystal ball, and those things don't work anyway. But
one other thought I had about the doors, and that is, if you have more than one facility, and that facility is used just for Sunday school, and Sunday school is over, that facility needs to be locked down, not only to keep people out, but to ensure that people, not only to keep out an active shooter, but also to ensure the children are not still, loitering in there and raising other types of risks. And so every classroom ought to be locked when they're finished using it. Every external building ought to be locked when it's not in use. And that way you do manage your space by not having to patrol the entire facility, but only the facilities being used.
And there's even we think about something bad and evil going on during worship. Well, and Matt's talking about during Bible class. Bible classes, when they're going on, there's devices that you can buy. What if something happens during that time, and there's one or two bad guys in the building? Do you have something in place that your teachers know to take that device? And there's some really nice, inexpensive, they're not too expensive. That's that savings institution thing I'm saying again. Buy some of those things, and it would...
To be able to lock it from the inside.
Lock it from the inside.
To barricade the door from the
And there's some very nice wedges that goes under the... folks can do their homework, purchase one, $40, $50, and wedge that. They're not going to come in.
Good stuff. I know our time's gone. We've got about 2 minutes left, but what about security cameras? We mentioned that a moment ago. Could those be employed and used effectively in trying to prevent situations that might arise?
Banks have cameras, but they get robbed. Convenience stores have cameras. They get robbed. But how many you take a church building, as we say, and it's got a little nice sign out front that says, and I've seen those, and I like them. This building and grounds is under constant video recording. You're under video surveillance. Who knows, that might make one guy leave if he's walking up there with evil in his heart. Sure. He could.
But my one piece of advice is don't bluff. Don't put out a sign saying this parking lot is under surveillance and not have surveillance, because that could give some people some artificially sense of security that isn't there, and you have some liability.
Right. And it may make the next guy put on a mask when he comes back. But again, we don't know. But we love cameras.
That's right. Listen, everything that you guys have said tonight has been spot on. I appreciate very, very much. Kevin, Matt, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, willingness to be here. Thank you for being a part of our program tonight. Hope to see you back here in 2 weeks. Thank you. God bless.
This has been GBN Live.